Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. I'm your host, Hannah Zuberi, and you're watching us on Muslim Network TV, America's only Muslim-focused television network. You can always watch us 24/7 on Galaxy 19, Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. Today, I have another episode of Women in Justice. Our guest today is Jenny Bencomo-Suarez. She's a Latina cross-cultural community organizer, and she's been part of the Abolish ICE and Sunrise movements dedicated to immigration rights, reproductive justice, and climate justice. She's based in Kentucky. In 2015, Jenny was the recipient of American Youth Leadership Program and traveled to Cyprus to study Near Eastern environmental policy and inter-communal conflict. She studied Arabic in Morocco and gained her TEFL certificate teaching high school students there. Now she studies Latin American and Latino studies and Middle Eastern Islamic studies at the University of Louisville and is an Explore Brazil scholar. Jenny was the hub coordinator at Sunrise Louisville Hub, a volunteer at La Casita Center, and has been recently hired as the SEIU labor union as a union organizer. With the core principles of conviction, passion, and consistency, she strives for liberation and justice within a collection of movements. Welcome to the show, Jenny.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I know we read an introduction about you, but I really want to get to know you and I would love for you to describe yourself. Please introduce yourself to our audience and describe your work in more detail.
Hi, everyone. As she said, my name is Jenny Bencomo-Suarez. I'm a community organizer, I'm an abolitionist, and I believe in intersectionality. I also believe in internationalism. I just recently graduated with my BA from U of L. And then during the coronavirus pandemic, I was actually ironically laid off from the labor union. So then I started working more in mutual aid efforts this year to ensure that people who are getting laid off were housed. And then the uprisings happened in Louisville, Kentucky, as they were happening globally, right? It has global implications, these uprisings, especially in the United States, where there's major police brutality. And so we were on the streets demanding justice for Breonna Taylor. Now we're on day 80-something, and the folks are still active, still demanding justice for Breonna Taylor, and still demanding for systemic change to defund and abolish the police. So those have been my efforts most so recently rather than academic. Because we really need people on the ground, we need people to be active, and we need people to continue fighting. Just put your mask on, get some hand sanitizer, and let's go.
And that's so important because a lot of times when the headlines move on, people tend to move on too. So what have you learned in these past 86 days that you wish you knew 86 days ago?
What I wish I could have learned before the 86 days was, I knew that there was mass corruption, but that it went this deep, and how many people are complicit in gentrification, complicit in not doing enough, you know what I'm saying? And so what I wish I would have learned before these 86 days was also how resilient people are in a global pandemic. Because I was always aware, I had always felt like, people, for a variety of reasons, right, from capitalism to other systemic circumstances, are not able to be as present on the streets. However, for as god-awful as coronavirus is, I don't want any of us to go back to pre-COVID-19. You had folks working 40 plus hours a week, making minimum wage, not being able to be politically active in the process. And so now you're seeing how these uprisings have catapulted because people are now able to be present for, politics, to demand better, to demand justice. I think that so many of us were quick to assume that people perhaps were apathetic or just didn't feel moved enough. But in reality, it's like when you're working for so many hours, when you're working 2-3 jobs, you're not able to be present. You're not able to hit the streets. And so with pretty much half the nation being unemployed, now you're seeing these new waves of new leaders and new recently radicalized, politicized activists hitting the streets, many of whom are young people. So, yeah.
And that is something that we're seeing across the country. We're seeing this because it's affected every strata of society. And this is something that is so heartwarming to be able to see that, especially for those who've been on the streets for years and years and years. The new wave of people joining others on the street is really heartwarming. And, so that is something definitely. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit more about you first. So we're going to jump right straight into all the justice work that you have dedicated yourself towards. And we have so much to talk about. So how did you first arrive at your journey of political and social activism, and what inspired you to become such a strong advocate for marginalized communities?
I think that's always like a tough question for me, because I think as people who oftentimes are labeled as the minorities, which is now a term that I'm recently pushing back on, because I think people like you and me constitute part of the global majority. And that, especially white Americans and settlers in the United States and Israel have to reconcile with what their identity is outside of settler states, right? And outside of Europe. Because Black and brown people are the global majority. But having been labeled that, and having been living in such a messed up country in a number of ways, where there's so many systemic issues, and being the daughter of immigrants, I think I always grew up incrementally radicalizing, right? So my parents are people who read a lot, who like to stay educated. We, watch the news a lot growing up, but also growing up in an immigrant neighborhood, and also seeing how, my family, when they migrated from Cuba, how is it that my father, who was an economist, a college professor, now has to work 2-3 jobs for us to sustain growing up, and for me to have access to healthcare, because he works at UPS overnight. So that's what grants him healthcare. But growing up, it's like you start asking more questions. Why is a universal human right, such as healthcare, being attached to a job? What happens if you lose that job? What happens if you get injured at the job and you can't perform the job anymore? Things of that nature, right? And then also seeing the tensions between the United States and Cuba growing up, and me always feeling like I was in the middle of it. I don't believe that, sanctions are something that should occur against any country, because it's not like it affects the government. At most, it affects the people. So when you see that the people are economically, being strangulated, and then on top of that, they're putting more restrictions on Cuban Americans in terms of how much money they're able to to send home. And then on top of that, there's just so much. I don't know what to say. Growing up, we've had to see 9/11, and we've had to see how the consequences of 9/11 and how much that's affected immigrant communities, especially Muslims, and then with the creation of DHS and ICE, and how much that's affected the Latino community, as well as other undocumented communities. And so by the time I was in high school, I had these feelings around it, but I didn't have exactly like the vocabulary to describe what I was feeling. And so after having more conversations with other people, and after reading more and being like, so that's what they did to illegally invade Iraq, that is US imperialism. So that is interest of oil at the expense of lives in the global south. So that is putting profit over people. And then on top of that, they're sending lower income working class Americans to go fight a war. What have the Iraqi people ever done to people like you and I? How is that a threat to national security? And so when I was seeing how in high school there were certain folks that were able to go to college, and then also there was other folks of a lower income who didn't see any other route to sustain themselves other than joining the US military.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was really exciting to see how, for the first time, we had a Democratic Socialist candidate, Bernie Sanders, who was demanding that we have free higher education, that we do have free, like, universal healthcare and things like that. And then when I moved to Morocco after I graduated high school, and the disappointment and anger I felt to see that Donald Trump had been elected because they decided to once again choose a mediocre centrist candidate that doesn't move people, Hillary Clinton. Of course we lost. Of course we lost. And so me being in Morocco the day that Trump got elected and seeing how many Moroccans were saying, or children were saying, the West hates us because we're Arab and Muslim, that broke my heart. And so I've definitely dedicated moving onward to connecting the dots of international struggles and having folks understand that we need to be in solidarity with each other. Like, Muslims need to be in solidarity with Latinx people, and Latinx people need to be in solidarity with urban Black communities, and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, it's been like an incremental series of radicalization. I can't say like this is the pinpointing event in my life in which I decided to be an organizer. I think also in high school, I started getting more involved with community organizers and radical Black and brown women outside of my high school, because I also went to a predominantly white high school and I never really felt like I fit in. So I was always trying to seek community outside of my high school. So yeah.
Word, when we, and this is for our audience, maybe many of them, when they hear this word radical, right? Especially as the Muslim community, because that's been something that has been used against us to criminalize us and treat us as inherently violent. What define this word for yourself, for the people, for the work that you do? What does that mean? What does that mean to you?
I definitely hear you on how that word has been used to criminalize not only Muslim communities, but I think Black and brown communities at large, especially whether it was the Black Panthers movement in the 60s and 70s. So I definitely hear you on that. To me, the word radical means a commitment to standing up for what is right, and the belief that it is above socially constructed borders and nationalities, and it means the commitment to uplift solidarity, to uplift universally given human rights by almost any means necessary to get that, to get what we need to secure basic needs, to secure human rights and dignity and justice. And I think that, being radical is also a commitment to speaking truth to power, even if it makes people uncomfortable, not messing with respectability politics. So I think oftentimes people love to tone police the most repressed, the most marginalized. And so it's also that belief that, no, you will not silence me. No, you will not tone police me. I might cuss at a politician because honestly, I think that we need to disrupt power. I think that is what a radical means. And it's terrible that word has been used to hyper criminalize Muslim people. I think that, a lot of young Muslims are also beginning to identify themselves as a radical, and that has nothing to do with terrorism. I think also we need to redefine what the word terrorism means. I think the United States has committed a lot of terrorist acts against Black and brown communities, not only in the United States, but globally.
Yes, I hear you. I hear you so much. I want to know what radical organizing in Kentucky looks like. I mean, as someone perhaps who lives in a blue state, or a state that has, maybe deeper roots in organizing of that sort. Tell me what that looks like, because from where we're at, all we see is this. Kentucky is the place that's like stopping progress in this country because of the variety of people that have been elected there. So, yeah, what does that look like for you?
The first thing I want to establish is the South. The American South is actually one of the most diverse regions in the United States, and we are actively being held hostage by right-wing forces that consist of actors like Mitch McConnell. So radical organizing has always existed in the South. The Highlander Center in Tennessee is a huge monument that speaks volumes to radical organizing. Eastern Kentucky, there's a bunch of rednecks there, because also redneck, now it has a more negative connotation because folks have twisted that. But redneck always used to mean that it was white folks, working class white folks, especially in rural communities, being in solidarity for anti-racism and economic justice efforts. So, I mean, I know hella folks in Eastern Kentucky that are very much down for the cause, that have been organizing, even some of whom that hysterically enough like to even call themselves cornbread communists. I think that in Louisville as well, we have always had a presence of organizing. I know in the 80s, there was a lot of strong labor union organizing. And then more recently, with the influx of immigrants that started coming in from the 90s, from Iraq, from Cuba, from all over the world, now we're seeing that the children of those immigrants, people like me, have been very active recently. But you've seen that minorities, people who are called minorities and immigrants, have had a more of a presence to organize in the past 10 years. There's been plenty of immigrant rights organizers that have popped up, Latinx leaders, Muslim leaders. So I definitely want to disrupt the idea in folks' heads that this is very much so a red state. Yeah, we do have Trump supporters. Yes, you will probably go to a rally in which the other side will be white supremacists. I mean, that's something that we've always had to deal with in the South, right? Things get really intense in the South. If you get arrested for a civil disobedience action in DC, you're out of jail most likely in a couple hours if it was peaceful. Here, it's like you get arrested for 18 plus hours and you're probably going to be denied food, water, medical attention. I mean, it's really intense. But I think that with the intensity of living in a region like this, that is what further radicalizes folks more to become organizers, to become activists, to resist the system.
And so now we're going into November, what sort of organizing are you seeing that you're super proud of, and I hear the history. What is currently happening in Kentucky? This is something that interests everybody because, as you know, you've heard, you've experienced it. It ends up being our like bane of existence. Like everything gets blocked by Mitch. So how are we ditching Mitch in Kentucky coming November?
That's going to be a harder question. That's going to be a much harder question for me to answer because for folks who don't know, Charles Booker was a young black man, or is a young black man from West End. He says, from the hood to the holler, we're going to be fighting for a Green New Deal. We're going to be fighting for racial and economic justice. And he was our most progressive candidate in the fight to ditch Mitch. But because of coronavirus and people needing to do absentee voting, well, the day that they opened up voting, in-person voting, there was only one voting place available for people to go to in Louisville. So there was major voter suppression. And so I don't think that we've been able to disrupt fully that barrier yet, the way that, we want to make gains like folks in New York have with electing an AOC, or, people in Minnesota have with electing an Ilhan Omar. And so now a lot of people are, of course, outraged that many of their votes were not counted. That because in the polls, Charles Booker was ahead of Amy McGrath, and so with Amy McGrath she's someone I like to honestly, quite frankly, call a mediocre centrist. I don't think that she is someone that inspires the people. I mean, one of the things she had said a while back was, oh, well, we're not letting Donald Trump do what he needs to do. And this is someone who's running as a Democrat.
Mm.
And so it's highly problematic, her platform. I think it was extremely triggering for Muslim communities and for anyone that's been that has had to flee imperialism or militarism in their home countries, when her political commercials was her flying in a fighter jet and her talking about her experience in the military. I do not believe that she is running on a platform for, healthcare for all. And so honestly, someone like Charles Booker that's had the experience of, being in poverty, coming from a lower income urban community, is someone who a lot of Kentuckians could resonate a lot more with, even folks from Eastern Kentucky, from Paducah, from Lexington to Louisville. And so now we're being met with, how do we convince people who are already exhausted, that are tired of being dismissed, that are tired of being silenced, to vote for another centrist just so we have Mitch out of office? So I don't know how this is going to go. I mean, recently in the polls, I think she was 4 or 5 points behind Mitch. And so I think that looking beyond electoral politics and looking beyond the system at large, and how do we replace the systems that are not serving us with structures that will nourish us, that will sustain us moving forward. Because I can't look at someone in the face, because I've had some Muslim friends of mine being like, I don't think I can vote for her. And so I think that, with people trying to shame people into voting for people like this, I don't think that's inspiring. I don't think that's helpful at all. Yes, voting can be used as a mechanism of harm reduction. But we honestly need to start looking beyond harm reduction, and how do we be more inclusive of people at large who have been disenfranchised so long from even the ability to vote. I mean, thankfully, Governor Bashir reinstated the right to vote for many felons, but that's just not enough. It's not enough. These candidates, they're just not it.
So are there candidates that on the ballot that are inspiring, that people are getting behind?
I know that honestly, one of the more inspiring politicians we've had was Charles Booker. Him being House Representative. We've had Attica Scott, who's like our version of AOC, who has very much stood up for immigrant rights, who has very much stood in favor of a Green New Deal, who has very much been in solidarity with all kinds of communities, and has really stood up to other political actors that have not served us, who have disenfranchised us. So those are the people I think that are the most inspiring in Kentucky. But I think looking beyond this election of how do we build power from the ground up, not just in the political system, but also outside of the political system. And for those who do want to run for office, how can we encourage them to run for office sooner, right? So that they do build up this platform, and so people do know who they are and what they're about, so that we can beat the Mitch McConnells, because there's plenty of obstructionists in our state.
Definitely. So one of the biggest components of your work has been climate justice advocacy and raising awareness about the Green New Deal. So what does climate justice advocacy mean for you? And tell us the ways that that you worked on this very extremely important issue in your life.
Definitely last year, when we were able to be more outside of our homes without a mask, there was some direct actions that the Sunrise movement had did in DC that I was a part of. And that's really good, because then we're bringing young people to take on a more larger stance and being like, no, we are going to be loud. We are going to disrupt. You're not going to obstruct our pathway to climate justice. I believe that was around the same time that Mitch McConnell was trying to shut down the vote for a pathway to a Green New Deal. And so we disrupted that. I think then after that, we started taking on a larger role of educating the community on what is a Green New Deal and what does climate justice mean. So a Green New Deal means that this is economic legislation for the country to transition to 100% green energy within a span of 11 years, because that's all we have left to stop irreversible climate change while also creating millions of good paying jobs for people. So that was something that was very inspiring, because I think oftentimes what happens is people become misinformed, right? Well, we need coal because these jobs are what sustains people. And it really doesn't. I mean, how many people have died from black lungs? So it's like, if we can train these people to transition out of coal energy and into green energy jobs, it would be a much more brighter, sustainable future. So that was something that we tried to do, especially town halls and meetings on engaging folks. So
and this is something, I want to, let's dig into that. A lot of young people who want to get into this work don't know where to start, don't know what does that mean. How do you organize a town hall? Who do you bring to a town hall? A lot of folks think you have to be extremely politically active or civically active to do this. So I want you to break down some of those barriers that people have set up for themselves.
I think definitely for young people to not be shy to show up to a meeting, and definitely make their voices heard and to take up space, and to demand for better. I know that the Sunrise movement does have hubs in various cities, but then also on their website, they have links for how to create a hub, how to join a hub, how to plug in. I think the good thing about a lot of the youth-led movement is that they've been able, through social media and online especially, create a pathway for people to join and to create community with that, because I think that a lot of the work requires community. It requires that we have conversations. And so definitely I want to encourage young people to start having these conversations with their other friends and showing up for one another and start attending these meetings, because I think also a lot of times what happens is that people get really intimidated when they see the larger work of well, there is this action today, there is this protest, but it's a lot of the work is being done behind the scenes, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's what I actively, because especially in this culture that with social media and posting everything online and a lot of performative work, that's not where it's at. So that is why people like you, that's why you're on this show, because your work has been so much behind the scenes and getting, really putting people together. And that's what organizing is all about, and not just being on the stage. And, so this is something that I really want to hit home with our audience, is each one of you can be potentially Jenny and putting people together. And that's how we build people power. So coming back to climate change, why did when you look at the list of things that affect marginalized communities, and each one of us has limited time and ability, or limited resources, what made you think this was the issue that was extremely important for you to get involved with, raise awareness about climate change, and how it disproportionately affects marginalized communities?
So I think that with climate justice, it affects everything, right? It is so interconnected beyond what people often think of right off the surface, in terms of people working these coal jobs that are not sustainable. So it's harming their bodies. They're not being paid well. To methane plants being put in urban Black and brown communities, and people who do not have the sufficient political, economic power to resist that in the ways that white communities do, right? Because they're not going to put that in an upper class white community, because they'll throw a fit and it's over. That plant, they wouldn't even think about putting it there. But why do the millionaires and billionaires and politicians put these heavily contaminating industries right in the heart of Black and brown communities. I think that is extremely problematic. It is morally wrong. I mean, that is why a lot of Black and brown folks have higher asthma rates, higher cancer rates. And then on top of that, going back to the jobs. So if we can create green energy jobs, then we can hire more people and give them a living wage. I think that, you know, climate justice really brings together racial justice, economic justice, and then also immigrants. I mean, we talk a lot about, you know, corruption. We talk a lot about U.S. interventionism abroad, especially in Latin America. But it's like, when we really think about it, the same industries that are being shipped abroad into the global South is really deteriorating the environment. So people are being forced to flee their homes because of mass flooding, because of higher intensity of hurricanes. They're being forced to migrate. So we're seeing more the term climate refugees become a more relevant term that we're using. And so, yeah.
And in locally too, you've talked about, here's a quote from you. For decades, working class communities and communities of color like mine have been first to be hit by pollution and last to be rebuilt after a climate disaster. And really, that is where the crux of the issue is that, again, this is not just a climate justice issue. It is a racial justice issue as well. It is a working class issue as well. How has this directly impacted your community?
I think definitely in terms of the plants and the industries being closer to mine. I think also when we think about natural disasters and stuff, where do they go to repair the infrastructure and to repair the electricity first and foremost? They're going to go to the white communities. They're not going to go to the immigrant communities. They're not going to go to the Black communities. On top of that, too, when we think about Latino communities at large in the United States, Donald Trump has repeatedly talked about building a stupid border wall that is disrupting wildlife, that is disrupting nature, that is really not good for the planet. And then on top of that is creating more obstacles for people who are fleeing from climate change to be able to migrate to the United States. So those are the ways that it has really affected and impacted my community. Because when I think about my community, I'm not only thinking about the Cuban community, I'm thinking about Latino communities at large. I remember that after Hurricane Maria and the devastation that caused, there was a lot more Puerto Ricans in my community because they had to relocate from Puerto Rico. So definitely all of those things I'm constantly thinking about when it comes to climate justice and the ways that it impacts folks like me.
A few quick actionable steps that you'd give everyday citizens who might be watching, local governments can take to foster positive changes in the community to best support the environment.
I think definitely applying pressure. Oftentimes we talk at large about like national politics, but there's so much that we can apply to pressure to local politics, like definitely like Metro Council. Another issue that we've been dealing with in Louisville is like 52,000 trees are being cut down, which, you know, when you think about it or when you bring it up to someone, oh, that's some hippie stuff. Like you're trying to hug a tree. No, like that's a serious issue. It's not just some hippie stuff that affects the quality of the air that we're breathing. So, you know, pushing for a tree ordinance in which there's a quota of how many trees will be planted each year. I think that's ambitious policy that can be achieved across local communities. I think also pushing for a local version of a Green New Deal to a state version of a Green New Deal. I think definitely going into these town hall meetings where politicians or candidates are at and be like, hey, like we need you to support and embrace publicly and openly a Green New Deal. And if you don't, we will apply pressure. We will escalate. I think escalation is a key tactic that, you know, all kinds of civil rights leaders have used to apply pressure.
Exactly. So one of the gems that I picked up from there that I hope people are paying attention to is local action. You know, all politics is local. Everything, like what affects you, nothing is too small to be relevant, and whether it's your city town hall council, your city or town council, whether it's your local school boards, whether it's putting educational elements into your local school curriculum on the environment. So much can be done locally that we've, in this whole national politics, we forget the work that can be done in where you live and where it affects you directly. Now let's talk about another branch of your work, and I know it weaves into your the work that you do in climate justice, but immigration rights. What does this topic represent for you? What does immigrant rights mean?
Immigrant rights for me means that people anywhere and everywhere have the right, the universal right to migrate. And we should not have some kind of security apparatus, whether it's DHS, ICE, detaining people for the God-given right to migrate, especially from the same problems that settler countries like the United States have created abroad and overseas, and have caused a lot of devastation and chaos that led for these people to migrate. So I think it's a much more encompassing term than like what we like to think about. I think it's also creating a pathway to citizenship for all undocumented people. And it's also abolishing ICE. We do not need ICE. ICE was a reactionary response to 9/11 and has caused for the detainment of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of immigrants, many of whom have gotten sick in their cells, have even died in ICE detention. And then more recently, with the arrival of COVID-19, many of these people have been deported to their countries, and that has caused the spread of COVID-19 across the Caribbean, for example. So when I think about immigrant rights, I think about supporting immigrants, embracing immigrants, welcoming immigrants, and stop creating the conditions for folks to have to flee from violence in their home countries.
And so can you share with us some of the work that is being done on that in your local region? What are the current, when you talk about abolishing ICE, what steps have been taken locally?
I do remember in 2018, there was like the waves of like people occupying the ICE buildings and offices and whatnot. And I think that was really great to apply pressure. But what I would have loved to see more of was the continuation of applying that pressure, and then also connecting the dots that if we're saying defund and abolish the police, that we're also saying defund and abolish ICE, because the two collude with each other. I mean, they both construct the police state. And so what's been done in my community is there's been some immigrant organizations that have been creating more like legal aid funds, and then connecting people with lawyers, and then also connecting volunteers to serve as accompaniments in the court and filling up the courtroom. Because people have said that when you fill up the courtroom, that can apply pressure for the judge to decide not to deport people. I think also there's been a lot of mutual aid being done to support immigrant communities, because a lot of undocumented people did not have any kind of access to federal aid, especially those $1,200 checks. So how can we support them in this time of need? A lot of that has been done, especially behind the scenes. Also applying pressure to our politicians to take a stance. I think obviously a lot more work needs to be done. I think a lot more work needs to be done in general to connect the dots nationwide, right? Because it's a greater struggle. I mean, we are demanding for systemic change. So I definitely want to encourage people that if you're saying defund, abolish the police, that we're also saying defund and abolish ICE, and that we're also educating our communities on what that looks like. But yeah.
Yes, and definitely across the country, ICE and the police work together hand in hand. Many of the sheriff departments, many police departments have contracts with ICE, where a simple traffic light stop could end up, asking for papers, taking you into a detention center. Are there many detention centers in Kentucky?
There is a detention center in northern Kentucky, and then there's also an ICE building here in downtown Louisville. And I do know that a lot of Latino immigrants are being detained in the detention center, as
Mhm.
well as African migrants as well,
Mhm.
even Muslim folks as well. And the conditions in that detention center, just like in any detention center, is god awful. It's inhumane.
That's doing this work as a woman, many times we face a lot of hurdles, blockages, things that are unexpected, yet we carry on, and a lot of emotional, social expectations are placed on women in this work. I wanted you to share with you what have been your personal blockades that people have placed in your work, and how have you overcome them?
Definitely being a woman, you feel like your work is oftentimes erased, right? Because it's like oftentimes what happens is cisgender straight men will gravitate towards the mic and they will announce themselves, I am the movement leader, I am this and that. But you don't see them oftentimes at a lot of meetings that
Mhm.
happen behind the scenes, right? And so it's like that erasure of femme labor, of women's labor. That happens all the time in many movement spaces. That's something that is straight from the history books that happens, right? I mean, I know that Angela Davis talks about her experience about that from the Black Panthers. So that's definitely an obstacle because I think men need to realize their privilege, especially as straight men when they take up space. And it's like they're not acknowledging the labor that's being done behind the scenes. I think that oftentimes the people who are like the OGs, like the classics of the movements, are always women. We do so much labor. But men oftentimes want to co-opt that labor and be like, I'm the movement leader. And then it's really problematic as well because it's like, I think we're shifting now away from that kind of paradigm around that dynamic of like, here's like the one or two leader. And it's like, that's not safe. I mean, from a security standpoint, that's not safe. I mean, that's how Malcolm X was targeted. That's how MLK was targeted. And the future really relies on decentralization, right? How can we build people power from the ground up? How can we mobilize as many young people as we can? How many workers can we mobilize to be more engaged, to be more present? It's not just about one leader or two leaders. The movement and the cause is much larger than just one person or two people. So I wish men would realize that more and actually attend more meetings. I think that's something that constantly happens, right? Is that erasure.
Where have in your circle, where have you found the spaces that have really uplifted you? Where has that upliftment come from to help keep going? Because this is tough work. People don't realize how, unless you're doing it every day. It's the small phone calls, it's the emails, it's the it's all that background stuff that doesn't seem important at that moment. So what keeps you uplifted? What keeps you going? Where are those spaces that you find yourself being and your voice being heard?
I think definitely the work can, like what you said, feel very isolating, very alienating. And so it's always important to keep that balance of having, yes, friends in the movement, but also friends that aren't necessarily like activists per se, that do support you, that do uplift you, that will embrace you, that will laugh with you and cry with you. And also taking time to take a break, to recharge a bit. I think that's also really important. Or like, with your movement friends being like, okay, from this time, from 7 to 9 p.m., we're just not going to talk about movement stuff. We're going to talk about being young. I think uplifting those boundaries at time are really important. But also like with movement elders, when I think about my movement elders, I think oftentimes of women. I think that they really understand that. I think that they're super supportive of that. And so, yeah, I mean, finding different sources of light, of being able to re-energize and get back in the game, I think that's super important. So I've definitely found that from a variety of folks within movement and outside of movement space.
Exactly. You need to have that somebody, you know, that time. And then to set boundaries are so important to keep going, because a lot of times you won't see, like you said, that maybe we won't see change, maybe not even in our lifetime, but maybe we will, right? So you always have to live between that hope and that fear. And that's definitely keeps that going. How, one of the other things that I often think about is a lot of times people forget that there's still a really long fight ahead. When we saw all those women come out for the Women's March the first time, and I remember, being really excited about that, because it was like, but then when you go there, you organize for it and you get there, and then it was a very like exoticizing experience. Like everybody would stop us on the streets and, oh, can we take a picture? Like a lot of us felt like caged animals, sort of like let loose in this zoo, I don't know, safari. It was very bizarre. And it really like turned out, but it was just like, okay, that happened. And now like, look at women, like American women, they're all like, just all the rights have been achieved and so what, in seeing this work, that in part of your work is women's rights work as well, what would you say to people who are looking at the women's rights movement, and really as a young person, as a person who's been, especially someone who's studying internationally, has seen the struggles across the globe, and sometimes seen the really, really deep work that is being done in the global South, compared to the sort of sometimes shallow work that is being done here? Would love to get your comment on that.
Were you feeling that way, like at the Women's March, like out of tokenization, like, oh, like here are the hijabis? Like, was that your experience?
Yes, it was. That was part of it, especially in the first one. The second one I didn't go to because I was so disgusted by my experience in the first one. And then the third one, it was much more locally led in DC. We had a lot of local organizers who were being uplifted and their voices were being centered. So we organized a women's, a Muslim women's contingent. And then this year, then after that, I was just like done with the way they treated Zahra Bilu and other organizers. So I sort of like washed my hands off of that. But I did, like, it was very interesting to see that, and I'd love to get a perspective from somebody who is doing this work on a daily basis.
I think oftentimes, like, non-white women often get really tokenized. And so it's, again, like setting up those boundaries, like, no, you will not tokenize me. Like, no, I'm not your pet, not your puppet. I'm not your minority token. I'm definitely not your minority token. I think also when you say about the long work that's ahead of us, I want people to realize, like, we cannot afford to get complacent. Because I remember, like, now that we're talking about how problematic the Women's March was, I don't know if you remember, like, that it was like a picture of, it was like these white women. If Hillary was in office, I'd be having brunch right now. And it's like, no, and no. Like, yes, like now we have like a straight up fascist in office, but neoliberalism is the death of many people, right? Her policies have costed entire nations like Libya to straight up crumble, right? And there's no plan in place. It created a political vacuum. And now we have sub-Saharan migrants being trafficked and, dying in the Mediterranean Sea. But I want white people to understand their place and their privilege and the consequences of those kinds of harmful comments, and how much that erases other people's struggles as well. Because, that highlights how little things affects their day-to-day. Whereas, for Muslim people, for Latinx people, for Black folks, it's way different. It affects us on the daily. And it not only has repercussions for us here, but it also has repercussions for our families abroad. So definitely, I want.
It doesn't matter who's in the White House. It does not matter at this point who's in the White House, because
yeah, exactly. It does not matter. It does not matter. I mean, like, Obama literally deported more people than Bush did. Okay, like, I'm pretty sure Obama dropped more drones than Bush did, and that speaks volumes. I mean, Bush like legally invaded another country. So I want people to understand, like, whether you decide to vote or whether you decide to, not be part of that process, if we do get Biden and Kamala Harris in the White House by 2021, we need to be applying so much pressure. We need to be in their faces. Straight up. Like, we cannot be like, oh, well, there's a Democrat. Because, like, I mean, people abroad and people here, like, feel the consequences whether there's a Democrat or a Republican in office. I mean, Biden paved the way for mass incarceration. That is why we see the school to prison pipeline. That is why the United States has the highest incarceration rates in the world, even though the United States only constitute 4% of the global population. So I want people to understand that we need to be applying pressure. But then on top of that, we need to be pushing forward for folks like AOC to be elected, that we have more AOCs, that we have more Rashidas and Ilhan Omars and Charles Bookers across the nation. I think that we also need to be consistent with our organizing and not just be reactionary, right? I'm so tired of turning on the news or, going to Facebook and saying that another Black person has been murdered at the hands of the state. I'm tired of these hashtags. Like, I don't want to see no more hashtags. I don't want to see that. I don't want to see more escalations between the United States and Iran. We need to have people who are actually competent to lead. And if they can't lead, we got to push them out of office. But we have to also think with the vision beyond just electoral politics. We need to be empowering people. We need to be educating people. And I think that's going to be extremely important, because oftentimes I think that, the United States is such an insular society, right? Because we talk about how limited the rights of people are abroad, but it's like, when we really think about it, traveling is really inaccessible for a lot of Americans. I think that that's often also why that if you're not an American who has immigrant parents, you don't understand the realities in other places because you haven't been to those realities. If only like 10% of Americans have access to a U.S. passport, then you know what I'm saying? So it's like, how can we also foster cultural exchange? How can we also foster education? How do we push to change the curriculum in public schools? I think that we need to be hitting the target with all kinds of tactics. And so, if your role is education, stick to education, change the curriculum, demand ethnic studies be a mandatory subject in public school and in universities. If your role is direct actions and you want to risk arrest, go for it. Let's do it. You know what I'm saying? Hopefully it'll be nonviolent, but I'm not someone to tell people how they should protest. You see what I'm saying? Like, it needs to be a variety of tactics.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jenny. We're at the end of the hour, and I've just really enjoyed this conversation. It was great from our other guest who has 40 years of experience doing this, and then to see some fresh ideas, and really, like, people need to see themselves in the role that you're in. And thank you for being that for a lot of young people out there. So I'm so glad our mutual friend, Rena, recommended to feature your work in this series.
I love Rena. She's such a baddie.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. And to all our audience, thank you so much for joining us on Muslim Network TV. We'll be here tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum.